The air in the small, sun-drenched sunroom of the Sunset Manor condominium was thick with the scent of freshly brewed herbal tea and the quiet, contained peace that Carol had earned only through profound loss and fierce self-determination. The room looked out onto a shimmering, artificial lake, its waters placid and untroubled, a stark contrast to the turbulent, hidden currents that had governed the last decade of her life. Carol sat in a plush armchair, her posture straight and steady, the very picture of elegant, late-life independence. Her hands, resting on the smooth, worn wood of the armchair arms, were 71 years old, soft yet strong, marked by the careful, delicate map of time and hard work, the same hands that had rocked her own daughter to sleep, nursed a dying husband, and most recently, signed the deeds that had irrevocably altered her world. At her feet, nestled comfortably against her skirt, sat her 10-year-old granddaughter, Lily. Lily was all thoughtful observation, her bright, open eyes absorbing the shadows that sometimes crossed her grandmother's face, sensing the weight behind the light-hearted stories Carol usually told. The question that hung in the air tonight was the one that had been whispered nervously by the adults in hushed tones over the last 6 months, ever since Carol had made her startling, definitive move. "Grandma," Lily asked, tracing the outline of a faded flower on Carol's sleeve. "Uncle Tyler told me that Aunt Jessica, my mom, didn't like it when you sold the big house. Why did you sell the house where Daddy grew up? Wasn't it too full of memories?" Carol reached down and gently cupped Lily's small chin, turning the child's face towards her, making sure their eyes met. "Memories are not tied to walls, sweet girl," Carol said, her voice a low, melodic texture that carried the faint, warm dust of Texas summers. "Memories are carried right here," and she tapped her own chest lightly over her heart. "But to understand why I sold that house, you have to understand what it became and what it cost me. It is a story about a house that was both a sanctuary and a burden, a story about a daughter who loved her mother, but who loved the idea of stability more. It is the story of how your own mother, Jessica, taught me the most important lesson of my life, that sometimes the only person you can truly count on is yourself." Carol paused, letting the silence deepen, the first stone of her narrative having been placed. She began with Frank, Lily's grandfather, the man whose memory, like the sun, still warmed her even 5 years after his sudden, devastating heart attack. The house was a beautiful Victorian, a grand 4-bedroom structure with high ceilings and a wraparound porch that Frank had restored with his own 2 hands over 2 decades, staining the wood, polishing the banisters, investing every spare hour and dollar into making it perfect. It was the house where they had measured Jessica's growth on the kitchen doorframe, where they had celebrated countless birthdays, and where they had finally, painfully said goodbye to Frank. But after his death, the sanctuary turned into a gilded cage. Carol's fixed income, meant to provide comfort, stretched taut against the crushing weight of the house's needs. The ancient furnace that wheezed through every Texan winter, the roof that leaked a cold, steady rhythm during the spring rains, and the sheer, physical impossibility of a 71-year-old widow climbing a ladder to clean gutters. Every peeled patch of paint, every squeaky floorboard, every loose banister became a physical monument to her increasing vulnerability. Jessica, Carol's only child, lived only 20 minutes away, inhabiting a sprawling suburban home that screamed of professional success, a marketing director with an attorney husband, a pool, and all the trappings of the American dream. Carol initially viewed Jessica's growing interest in her situation as kindness, as filial duty. During their weekly phone calls and family dinners, Jessica would meticulously point out every flaw. "Mom, you can't stay in that huge place forever," or "Have you thought about your future living arrangements?" Carol, naive in her love, thought her daughter was worried about her safety. She was deeply, profoundly wrong. Jessica wasn't seeing her mother, she was seeing the prime real estate lot beneath the aging Victorian. The neighborhood was gentrifying, and Jessica, the corporate strategist, was calculating the immense equity her mother was sitting on, equity she presumed would one day be her inheritance. Every suggestion of downsizing, every observation about the leaky roof, was a carefully calibrated hint, a subtle psychological pressure designed to hasten the transfer of the asset. The house, which Carol loved for its memories, Jessica loved for its market value. The turning point, the sharp, cold pivot upon which Carol's life swiveled, occurred on a bleak Thursday morning in March. A brutal cold snap had burst the main water line to the Victorian, turning the basement into a small, ruined lake and damaging Frank's old workshop equipment and irreplaceable boxes of family photographs. Carol, standing in the frigid, damp chaos, felt a genuine moment of terror and helplessness. She had spent 3 nights in a dingy, overpriced motel, bleeding cash she couldn't spare, unable to shower or even make a cup of coffee. Finally, swallowing her enormous pride, she called Jessica at her corporate office. "Honey," Carol had pleaded, her voice cracking with exhaustion and fear. "I hate to bother you at work, but I'm in a real bind. I have no water, and the plumber can't come until Monday. I just need a place to stay for a few nights, or just some support." The silence on the line was long, unnerving, and completely devoid of empathy. Carol remembered the audible, irritated sigh that finally broke the silence. Jessica's voice, usually modulated and smooth, was sharp with impatience. "Mom," she said, delivering the words like a series of small, cold stones. "You can't keep calling me every time something goes wrong with that house. I have my own family, my own responsibilities. It can't be your handyman, your hotel, or your problem solver. You're going to have to figure it out yourself." The words, 4 simple, brutal syllables, hit Carol with the force of a physical blow. Figure it out yourself. At 71, after raising her, mourning her father, and maintaining a life for 43 years, Jessica had reduced her mother to an inconvenient emergency, a problem that needed to be outsourced. Carol's attempts to explain, to soften the refusal, were met with an immediate, definitive hang-up. "I have a presentation, Mom. Call a plumber, call a hotel, call someone else. Stop calling me with these emergencies." Carol sat in the sterile, airless motel room staring at the call-ended screen, not just heartbroken, but fundamentally shattered. In that cold, lonely silence, something deep within her, the unconditional, enabling love of a mother, broke, making way for the iron-willed survival instinct that had seen her through the valley flood so many decades ago. Her daughter, in her supreme selfishness, had given her the ultimate permission, the permission to stop worrying about being a burden and to start worrying about her own independent survival. The frigid silence of the motel room, punctuated only by the distant sounds of traffic, was where Carol, the mother, died and Carol, the survivor, was resurrected. As she stared at the call-ended screen, the white-hot shame of being deemed an inconvenience was quickly replaced by a cold, surgical clarity. Jessica had challenged her, dismissed her, and judged her incapable of making adult decisions. What Jessica, the corporate strategist, failed to comprehend was that 3 weeks before that devastating phone call, her 71-year-old mother had already made the most adult, financially sound, and completely autonomous decision of her life. She hadn't been waiting to be rescued, she had been waiting for the final paperwork. Carol remembered the day she had contacted the real estate agent, a secretive, defiant act carried out while Jessica was preoccupied with a company merger. For months, Carol had been doing her own calculations. She hadn't just observed the peeling paint. She had observed the soaring property values in the historic district. The equity accumulated over 4 decades, the money Frank and she had poured into their Victorian home, was not Jessica's future nest egg, it was Carol's freedom fund. She had realized that the house, while holding their memories, was preventing her from living the rest of her life without the constant terror of a burst pipe or a collapsing roof. 3 weeks before the plumbing crisis, Carol had signed the purchase agreement for her condo, the closing scheduled for the following month. The moment she set foot in the active senior community called Sunset Manor, she knew she had found her true sanctuary, a maintenance-free condominium with modern amenities, a view of a lake, and most importantly, neighbors who genuinely wanted community, not inheritance. She had planned to announce the news triumphantly over a celebratory family dinner, but after Jessica's callous refusal to offer even basic support, Carol decided her daughter had forfeited the right to share in the good news. If Jessica wanted her to figure it out herself, then the reveal would be the consequence, not a surprise gift. The next morning, Carol checked out of the motel, paying the bill with a grim resignation, and drove directly to the home of her oldest friend, Eleanor. She explained the waterline, but pointedly omitted the conversation with Jessica, shielding her daughter from the judgment of others while struggling to cope with her own. During the 2 weeks that followed, while waiting for the closing to be finalized, Carol initiated the monumental task of sorting through 43 years of accumulated life. It was a silent, emotional process. Each packed box felt like shedding an unnecessary skin. The grief of letting go was tempered by the growing euphoria of liberation. Frank's tools, which Jessica had likely been eyeing as valuable antiques, were lovingly donated to a local vocational school, a place where young hands could honor Frank's craft rather than storing them in a basement waiting for inheritance. Bags of clothes and old furniture were given to charity. Carol was downsizing not just her possessions but her burdens, clearing the way for a future unencumbered by the past. Jessica called once, inviting her to her grandson Tyler's baseball game, speaking in clipped, busy tones about work and Mark's latest case, but never once asking if Carol had managed to figure out the water crisis. This negligence was the final, dull confirmation Carol needed. Her daughter saw her only as an obligation to be managed, not a person to be cherished. The final push came when the plumber, fixing the initial burst pipe, pointed out the structural doom awaiting the Victorian. The old water heater was failing, and there were signs of foundation settling that would cost tens of thousands to fix. This was the final straw. Carol called her real estate agent and pushed the closing date forward by 2 weeks. In the empty, echoing house on the final Thursday evening, Carol stood alone in the center of the living room, the indentations of where the sofa had sat for decades still visible in the faded carpet. She looked up at the height marks on the kitchen door frame, the emotional monuments to Jessica's childhood, and the sadness was profound, but it was not paralyzing. The sadness belonged to the past. The excitement belonged entirely to the future. She was signing away the house, yes, but she was signing her independence. Then came the necessary, final act of confrontation. That evening, Carol called Jessica. "Hi, honey," Carol said, her voice perfectly level, carrying an unnatural, steady calm. "Do you have a minute? I wanted to let you know that tomorrow morning at 10, I'm closing on the sale of the house." The silence that followed was complete, a hollow vacuum of shock. "Mom," Jessica finally stammered, the corporate composure completely gone. "What do you mean? You didn't tell me you were selling. You can't just make a decision like that without discussing it with family." The staggering irony of the demand, given Jessica's earlier callousness, did not escape Carol. "Actually, Jessica," Carol replied, letting the quiet strength in her voice carry the weight of her conviction, "I can make any decision I want about my property, and I have. I've purchased a beautiful condominium in a senior community called Sunset Manor about an hour north of here. It's maintenance-free, with a lake view, and I will have neighbors my own age who actually want to spend time together." The panic in Jessica's voice was palpable, escalating from confusion to outright fear, not for her mother's well-being, but for the lost asset. "An hour north? Mom, that's too far. What if something happens to you? What about the family history? What about the inheritance?" she cried, revealing the cold, calculating heart beneath the facade of concern. Carol delivered the final, precise strike, using the weapon Jessica herself had forged. "Well, Jessica," Carol said, her tone deliberately pleasant, yet laced with fatal precision, "I guess I'll just have to figure it out myself. And as for the memories, they come with me. As for the antiques, I donated your father's tools to a vocational school. They will be put to good use." The devastating simplicity of her actions, selling the house and liquidating the expected inheritance, reduced Jessica to raw emotional chaos, forcing her to confront the true cost of her neglect. Carol hung up the phone, her hands shaking slightly, but her spirit soaring. The transaction was complete, and she was finally entirely free. The closing day arrived with the clean, crisp light of a perfect spring morning, a day that felt momentous, not sorrowful. Carol dressed in her best navy blue suit, the one Frank had always said made her look distinguished, and drove herself to the law offices, feeling neither guilt nor regret, but a profound humming sense of self-possession. The process was a study in contrasts. First, she met with the buyers of the Victorian house, a young couple, the husband a carpenter, who spoke with genuine, wide-eyed reverence for Frank's craftsmanship and promised to restore the home lovingly. Watching these strangers take legal ownership of the place where she had spent the happiest years of her life should have been heartbreaking. But as Carol signed the final papers, she felt a liberating detachment. She was signing away the house, yes, but she was signing her independence. The memories she knew were packed neatly in her heart, not tied to the peeling paint on the north wall. An hour later, at a different table, with different lawyers, Carol signed a new set of papers, officially becoming the owner of her lakeside condominium in Sunset Manor. This moment, the acquisition of a small, modern, maintenance-free home, felt like the true beginning of her 72nd year. She spent the entire weekend moving in, with her friend Eleanor and a few kind acquaintances from her church volunteering their time. They worked together, laughed over packing mishaps, and by Sunday evening the small condo, filled with her carefully chosen furniture and framed photographs of Frank, felt immediately and undeniably like home. It was a home built not on obligation, but on friendship and earned dignity. Jessica, though she had been given the full details, did not call, did not text, and certainly did not appear to help. Her silence was not a surprise. It was simply another piece of evidence confirming the new, cold reality Carol now accepted. It was Tuesday afternoon when Jessica finally broke the silence. Carol was sitting on her small patio, which overlooked the shimmering expanse of the community lake, reading a book and basking in the quiet, simple pleasure of being undisturbed. She heard the crunch of tires on the gravel drive and looked up to see Jessica walking toward her. The daughter's expression was an unfamiliar mask, a contorted blend of devastation, exhaustion, and simmering fury, a fury born entirely from the realization of her own loss. "Hi, honey," Carol said calmly, setting her book down. "This is a nice surprise. Would you like some iced tea?" Jessica sat down stiffly in the chair across from her, ignoring the tea offer. She looked around the patio, at the manicured flower beds, at the peaceful view of the lake, at the well-maintained community grounds visible through the trees. "It's nice," she admitted finally, sounding genuinely surprised, as if she expected her mother to be living in a hovel. "Thank you, I think so too," Carol replied, her tone perfectly pleasant. Then Jessica leaned forward, her voice urgent and laced with raw panic. "Mom, we need to talk about what you've done." "What I've done?" Carol echoed gently, raising an eyebrow. "You mean what I've done about figuring out my own problems and making adult decisions about my living situation?" Jessica winced, the words acting like a physical jab. "I know you're angry about what I said, but I'm not angry, Jessica. Anger implies that I still have expectations that can be disappointed. I've moved beyond that." "What does that mean?" Jessica demanded, her voice rising. Carol looked at her daughter, taking in her expensive creased suit and the exhaustion under her eyes. She spoke slowly, with a clear, devastating sincerity. "It means that for the first time in 5 years, I'm not spending my days worrying about being a burden on you. I'm not lying awake at night wondering if the next crisis will be the one that finally exhausts your patience completely. I'm not constantly grateful for scraps of attention or afraid to ask for help when I need it. You didn't have to say it. It was clear in every sigh, every suggestion that I should consider other options, every time you pointed out something that was wrong with the house. You saw me as a problem to be managed, not a person to be loved." Jessica's face crumpled, tears finally beginning to track paths through her carefully applied makeup. "That's not true. I thought I was being practical. I thought I was helping you face reality." "No, Jessica. You were helping me face your reality where I was becoming inconvenient, where my problems were interfering with your life, where the house you expected to inherit was costing more to maintain than you thought it was worth." This was the moment for the final critical truth. Carol held her daughter's gaze steadily. "The house sold for $475,000, she stated quietly. "After paying off the small mortgage balance and closing costs, I cleared over $400,000. Combined with your father's life insurance and our savings, I now have more than enough money to live independently and comfortably for the rest of my life." Jessica's face went white. The news, the immense staggering fact of her mother's total, unassailable financial independence, was a blow far heavier than the loss of the house itself. It shattered the last remaining pillar of Jessica's belief system, the idea that her mother was a needy dependent who required her management. Carol leaned forward slightly. "I'm telling you this so you understand that I don't need you to take care of me anymore. I don't need you to manage my problems or make my decisions. I figured it out myself, just like you told me to do." Jessica was crying harder now, the sound raw and desperate. "But I love you. You're my mother." "Love isn't just a feeling, sweetheart," Carol concluded, her voice softening, but remaining firm. "It's a choice we make about how to treat people. And when I needed you to choose love, you chose convenience instead. Now you must choose what happens next.
Not because you feel guilty, and not because you're worried about some future inheritance that no longer exists the way you thought it did. Be a better daughter because you genuinely want a relationship with the person I actually am, not the problem you thought I should be. The long silence returned, now charged with the possibility of a difficult, uncertain reconciliation.